In the quiet folds of the early 20th century, when the sun still pretended never to set on the British Empire, there lived a woman whose story shimmered between the edges of myth and memory. Enid Lindeman, born to colonial privilege, tempered by tragedy and adorned with wit and beauty, was the kind of soul history often misremembers. She danced through the courts of Europe, loved and buried men of power, and left behind whispers rather than monuments. Yet one cannot help but wonder, what if Enid Lindeman, instead of drifting through empire, had chosen to reshape it? What if she had used her charm and fortune not merely to survive, but to redraw the very boundaries of the world itself? Good evening, dear listener. I am so grateful you've joined us in this hour of reflection. Tell me, where and when are you listening? Perhaps you sit by a soft lamp, or a winter window, or somewhere far warmer. Wherever you are, settle your thoughts. Subscribe if you wish, and let us begin, together, down the corridor of what might have been. The year was 1892, and in the soft coastal light of New South Wales, a child named Enid Lindeman first opened her eyes to the world. Her father, Charles Lindeman, built his fortune upon the back of wool, a material that bound Australia's vast plains to Britain's mills. The empire was not an idea in those days. It was a texture, a smell, a rhythm. The ships that left Sydney Harbour carried not only bales of wool, but also the dreams of a continent that believed itself both young and ancient, destined and dependent. Enid grew up beneath the flutter of both the Union Jack and the gum tree, feeling the strange pull between belonging and observation that would haunt her entire life. She was a child of means and manners, yet also one of curiosity. Her tutors, imported from England, spoke of civilization as though it were a gift bestowed from one shore to another. But when she walked with her governess among the Aboriginal women who sold woven baskets by the pier, she saw something the lessons never mentioned, an older dignity, a quiet resistance beneath the colonial politeness. In our true history, Enid absorbed these impressions without action. But in our other history, the one we dream tonight, something shifted. The young Enid began asking questions that no girl of her station should have asked. "Who owns the sea?" she asked once, "and who drew the lines that say this land is yours, and that one mine?" Her father laughed, fondly but dismissively. "Men of reason drew them, Enid," he said. "The world must be ordered, or it would fall apart." Yet as she stood at the window, watching the great ships slide into the horizon, she wondered if the world had already fallen apart and no one had noticed. The Lindeman estate was a place of polished mahogany and piano music, but outside its verandas stretched the vast uncertainty of a continent still being tamed. The servants were quiet, the horses restless. From her earliest days, Enid felt both secure and captive, a paradox that would define her later dealings with men, politics, and power. She read of Queen Victoria and Cleopatra in the same breath, her imagination stitching together empires and tragedies as if they were one fabric. As adolescence came, so too did beauty, the kind that drew attention like a tide. Photographs of Enid in her teens show eyes that seem to look through rather than at the world. In London society, beauty was a weapon. In colonial Australia, it was a prophecy. Everyone said she would marry well, perhaps even marry into England itself. Yet she felt a strange restlessness, a sense that her life would not be contained by the polite drawing rooms of her parents' generation. In this alternate history, that restlessness becomes her quiet rebellion. She begins keeping a journal, not of parties or suitors, but of maps. She sketches the globe from memory, then redraws its borders according to justice as she perceives it. "If a line divides hunger from abundance," she writes at 15, "then perhaps it should be erased." Her governess finds the journal one day and burns it, afraid her charge might be mocked or worse, educated beyond her place. But the act plants another kind of fire. By 1908, Enid had come of age in a world at its imperial height. The The Boer War was over, the Edwardian age glittered with confidence, and women like Enid were expected to be ornaments to men who built and governed. But our Enid, in this reimagined thread of history, watches instead. She attends her first ball not to find a husband, but to study the way men speak of the natives, the colonies, the burden. She notes how even their laughter carries hierarchy. She smiles, dances, and memorizes their words. She begins to understand that power, like music, depends on who conducts it and who listens. At 19, she meets Roderick Cameron, the wealthy shipping magnate from New York. In our real timeline, she marries him and follows him to London, beginning a life of glamour and loss. But here, in the gentle folds of this imagined world, her decision is slower, more deliberate. She senses in Roderick not love, but access, a way into the salons and embassies of empire itself. She accepts his proposal not from naivety, but from strategy, telling herself she will learn from him, as one studies a language before mastering it. The wedding takes place beneath the soft sun of Sydney, the union celebrated as a triumph of colonial refinement. Yet as the guests toast to prosperity, Enid gazes out to the horizon, the waves flickering gold under the evening light. Somewhere beyond that edge lay London, Cairo, Delhi, places where the empire's pulse was strongest and its fractures deepest. She felt both drawn and burdened by the knowledge that she would soon walk among its architects. On the night before she sails, her father gifts her a compass. "To guide you home, wherever you may go," he says. She turns it over in her hand, feeling the weight of brass and expectation. "Perhaps," she whispers, "it will guide me somewhere new." The morning sea wind carried both salt and questions. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Enid stood at the rail, her white gloves trembling slightly. Behind her, the land of her birth receded. Before her, a world of unseen corridors awaited. The gulls cried overhead as if to remind her that flight, too, has its dangers. And so begins our story, not of what was, but of what might have been. London in 1911 was a city at the height of its self-assurance. Its domes and spires pierced a sky gray with coal smoke. Its streets glittered with wealth and weariness in equal measure. Enid Lindeman Cameron arrived among trunks and expectation, her beauty already the subject of gossip in both hemispheres. The newspapers called her the Australian Venus, though to her mind that was an error. She did not wish to be worshipped. She wished to see, truly see, the machinery of empire from its beating heart. In this imagined strand of time, she steps onto English soil not as a young bride dazzled by aristocratic society, but as a quiet observer entering an ancient machine, intent on discovering where its levers lie. Roderick Cameron, her husband, was handsome, cosmopolitan, and occupied by his shipping empire, a man more interested in roots and profits than in the inner life of his wife. Enid found herself drifting through drawing rooms where conversations circled endlessly around the same subjects: horses, shares, and marriages. The rhythm of London's high society seemed to her both mesmerizing and meaningless. In the afternoons, she took solitary walks along the Thames, watching the barges pass under Westminster Bridge, their decks crowded with men from the colonies, Caribbean sailors, Indian laborers, Africans in threadbare coats, each bearing the weight of a world built upon other worlds. The irony did not escape her. Here was the empire's bloodstream, flowing with faces that England pretended not to see. Her curiosity soon found a home in the gatherings of suffragists and reformers who met in smoke-filled back rooms and rented halls. Enid attended first in secret, then openly. The women spoke with fierce conviction about votes, wages, and education. But it was when an Indian writer named Sarojini spoke of the empire as a golden cage, where some birds sing and others starve, that Enid felt something awaken deep within her. She began to sense that her charm, so carefully cultivated, could be more than a social adornment. It could be an instrument. She learned how to ask questions that made powerful men listen, if only to flatter themselves with their own answers. She took notes, not on paper, but in the delicate theater of conversation. The London fog seemed to her a metaphor for the age, soft, concealing, and somehow comforting in its ambiguity. She could walk from Mayfair to Whitechapel and feel as though passing from one world to another. In this reimagined life, she befriends Egyptian and Irish students living in the city's poorer quarters, men and women who dream aloud of independence. They speak to her not as a duchess-to-be, but as a comrade in disillusionment. She listens, she questions, and she begins to see the empire not as an inevitability, but as a design, one that could, with imagination, be redrawn. When she returns to her townhouse in Belgravia, Roderick waits with impatience. "You spend too much time among radicals," he says, pouring brandy into crystal. "They'll ruin your reputation." She smiles faintly, replying, "Perhaps reputation is a kind of empire, too, and perhaps it needs its revolution." Their marriage, like so many of the time, became a polite arrangement. He traveled, she entertained. Her soirees drew diplomats, poets, and politicians, each unaware that beneath her laughter, she was studying their words like chess moves. At one dinner, a young member of Parliament spoke of the noble duty of rule, to which Enid replied softly, "Rule is not noble when it forgets to listen." The table fell silent, broken only by the delicate sound of silver against china. Later that night, as the guests departed, she lingered by the window, watching the carriages vanish into the mist. In her diary, she wrote, "London is a city built on the illusion of permanence, but even fogs clear." Her beauty granted her entry to circles that would otherwise remain closed. Yet behind her grace, she began forming quiet alliances. A journalist from Calcutta introduced her to pamphlets banned in Britain, tracts on self-determination, on the morality of colonialism, on the cost of conquest. She did not agree with every word, but she felt the pulse of a new world stirring beneath them. Through her influence, she arranged for small discussions between reformers and sympathetic British intellectuals. These gatherings were discreet, almost invisible to history, yet in our imagined thread they plant ideas that ripple outward, tiny shifts that may, in time, move continents. At home, Roderick's detachment deepened. He found her intellect unsettling, her compassion inconvenient. The war between their silences became unbearable. One evening, after a dinner of perfunctory conversation, he muttered, "You speak as if you could change the world, Enid." She met his gaze and said, "Perhaps only the world inside people's minds, but that is where every empire begins." They did not speak again that night, and in the months that followed, the distance between them grew vast as the ocean that had once carried her away from home. In the spring of 1913, she returned briefly to Australia to visit her ailing father. The voyage offered time to think, and the sea, endless and indifferent, became her confessor. Standing on the deck at dusk, she felt the hum of the engines and thought of trade routes, of colonies, of invisible connections that bound millions to a few. She traced the stars above and imagined the lines of empire redrawn beneath them, not in boundaries, but in bonds. By the time the ship docked at Sydney, the idea had become a quiet resolve to live not as an ornament of empire, but as its student and, when possible, its gentle saboteur. Her father's passing that winter marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. She inherited wealth enough to live without dependence, and freedom enough to choose her direction. When she returned to London, she no longer sought invitations to court, but to conversation. Her friends now included suffragists, socialists, and scholars from the colonies, all gathering beneath her roof under the guise of charity dinners. They debated, they disagreed, they dreamed. Some dismissed her as naive, others as dangerous. She smiled at both judgments. To her, they were proof she had begun to matter. By late 1914, when the Archduke's death in Sarajevo ignited the fuse of war, Enid stood at the threshold of transformation. London's fog thickened, its music softened, its men marched. The empire she had admired, questioned, and critiqued was about to face its own reckoning. She watched soldiers board trains bound for France and thought not of glory, but of consequence. The lines of empire, she realized, were drawn not in ink, but in blood. And soon, that blood would soak every border. As the first bells of war echoed through the city, Enid turned from the window, her silhouette caught in the dim light. "Perhaps," she whispered to no one, "this is the beginning of an end." The war came like a tide that did not retreat. It swept through London's streets, through letters and headlines, through every whispered conversation in drawing rooms that now trembled with uncertainty. Roderick Cameron, preoccupied with his business and reputation, took pride in his ships serving the war effort, while Enid found herself drawn into a different kind of service. She joined the Red Cross, first as a patron, then as a nurse in training. Her delicate hands, once suited to crystal and lace, learned the texture of bandages and the chill of metal instruments. The transformation was quiet but complete. The world she had studied from behind silk curtains now revealed its flesh and its cost. The hospitals were places where illusion went to die. Rows upon rows of young men, some scarcely older than boys, filled the wards with the sound of breathing, shallow and fragile. Enid walked among them carrying water and solace, her movements deliberate, her voice a soft anchor in the noise of pain. Among the wounded were men from every corner of the empire, Australians, Indians, Irish, Africans. Their accents mingled like wind through broken glass. She listened as they spoke of homes they might never see again, of promises made by generals and forgotten by governments. Each story seemed to her another crack in the glittering mask of empire. One night, while tending to a soldier from Delhi who had lost both legs, she asked gently, "Why did you come so far to fight?" He smiled faintly and said, "Because they told us we were part of the family." The words haunted her long after his death. When Roderick died in 1914 of pneumonia, she received the telegram without tears. There was affection, but no grief. His passing released her from the polite captivity of a marriage that had long since ceased to breathe. Society, ever watchful, called her tragic. Yet in this alternate path, Enid experienced widowhood not as tragedy, but as awakening. The window that had once shown her only the surface of the world now opened wider, revealing the machinery beneath. She sold much of her jewelry, converted her home into a place of refuge for wounded soldiers from the colonies, and began corresponding with reformers across the empire. Her name appeared less in gossip columns and more in letters marked confidential. Through these correspondences, she came to understand the invisible web that connected suffering from Cairo to Calcutta, from Dublin to Johannesburg. The empire, she realized, was not merely geography. It was a pattern of dependency, reinforced by wealth, justified by rhetoric, and enforced by silence. If silence is the price of belonging, she wrote in her journal, then perhaps belonging is not worth the cost. Yet even as her intellect deepened, her heart did not harden. She found beauty in the smallest gestures, the way a soldier smiled at a letter from home, the sudden hush of dawn over a city that refused to sleep. There was tenderness even in ruin. Sometimes, at the close of her shifts, she would stand by the hospital window and gaze out into the darkness, seeing not stars but lanterns swaying in the mist. To her, they looked like souls, flickering, uncertain, yet unwilling to go out. It was during one such night that she met Valentine Brown, the Earl of Kenmare, an Irish nobleman whose estates had been scarred by rebellion and neglect. He was older, courteous, and possessed of a quiet melancholy that matched her own. They spoke first of the war, then of Ireland, then of the fragile threads that held nations together. "The empire is a ship too large for its own sea," he said once. Enid smiled sadly. "Then perhaps it needs a new captain, or perhaps a new ocean." Their friendship grew into affection, and affection into love. Not the feverish kind that burns out quickly, but the slow, steady flame of companionship born of shared solitude. Through Valentine, Enid encountered the complexity of Ireland's struggle more intimately than ever before. In this reimagined world, she did not merely listen, she began to act. She used her connections in London to advocate for leniency toward imprisoned Irish rebels and arranged quiet meetings between sympathetic officials and moderates from Dublin. These efforts went unnoticed by the newspapers, but not by those who mattered. She learned to navigate between loyalty and dissent, always cloaked in charm, but guided by conviction. By 1916, the world outside her window had become almost unrecognizable. The war had devoured millions, the air reeked of loss, and yet the machine of empire ground on. The Easter Rising in Dublin stirred her deeply. She read the reports of executions and felt each name as a tolling bell. To rule by punishment, she wrote, is to rule by fear, and fear is no foundation for a home. Her letters to Valentine, now stationed in Ireland, grew increasingly political. "There will be no peace," she told him, "until the powerful learn to listen to those they call subjects." When the armistice finally came in 1918, London erupted in exhausted jubilation. Enid stood among the crowds in Trafalgar Square, watching flags wave over faces lined with disbelief. She felt no triumph, only a strange stillness. The empire had survived, but at what cost? The colonies had bled for a crown that scarcely knew their names. The streets were filled with cheers, yet behind the noise she sensed a deeper question. What now? The war had revealed the fragility of the old order, and Enid, ever the observer, recognized that in such moments history was soft enough to be shaped. In her private thoughts, she began to form an idea that would later define her alternate legacy. If the empire could not be destroyed by force, perhaps it could be reimagined by persuasion. Perhaps influence, the kind earned through conversation, generosity, and grace, could accomplish what armies could not. And perhaps a woman, precisely because she was underestimated, could become its architect. On a cold evening in 1919, she sat alone by the window of her London home, the streets below still bearing the marks of wartime austerity. The city was quieter now, its grandeur slightly frayed. She looked out at the lamps flickering against the fog and thought of all the men she had nursed, the letters unanswered, the borders defended and broken. "The world," she murmured, "has been redrawn in blood. Who will redraw it in kindness?" Outside, the last of the night trains rumbled past, carrying the wounded home to whatever awaited them. Enid closed the curtain, feeling the faint pulse of determination in her chest. The widow's window had become her mirror, and in its reflection, when peace returned to Europe, it arrived limping, like an old soldier too proud to admit defeat. The year was 1920, and London, though triumphant in name, felt hollowed by absence. The laughter in its clubs sounded brittle, and even the grand avenues carried an air of exhaustion. Amid this landscape of uncertain recovery, Enid Lindeman, widowed yet unbroken, moved with a grace that seemed out of time. She'd seen too much to be frivolous and lost too much to be afraid. It was then that Valentine Browne, 6th Earl of Kenmare, returned from Ireland, weary from war, and weighed down by the burden of a title that had become more ghost than glory. In our alternate history, their meeting was not the happenstance of aristocratic circles, but a convergence of two restless spirits who recognized in each other a shared disquiet toward the order of things. Valentine's Ireland was a land of contradictions, green and grieving, proud and poor, still trembling from rebellion and reprisal. His estates, vast and beautiful, lay mostly barren, abandoned by tenants who had fled famine, war, or despair. He confessed to Enid that he no longer knew what it meant to be a lord in a land that hated lords. She listened, not as a lady of sympathy, but as a mind already turning toward the question of justice. "If ownership no longer brings harmony," she said one afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park, "perhaps the ownership itself must be reimagined." He looked at her then, startled by her candor, but found in her eyes neither accusation nor arrogance, only curiosity. It was that quiet intelligence, that willingness to ask what others dared not, that drew him closer until companionship became affection, and affection became a marriage both tender and radical in its possibilities. When Enid became Lady Kenmare, society expected her to retreat into the rituals of titled life. Instead, she transformed the Kenmare estates in County Kerry into something closer to a living experiment. In this reimagined world, her influence begins here. Where her predecessors had imposed control, she offered dialogue. She convinced Valentine to open portions of his lands to cooperative farming, allowing tenants to own a share in their harvests. It was a modest gesture, but its symbolism was profound, an aristocratic household recognizing, however quietly, that the age of dominion was ending. The local papers called it an eccentric charity. The London ones, when they noticed, referred to it as an indulgence of the Colonial Countess. But among the people of Kerry, word spread that the lady from Australia listened more than she spoke. Through letters and introductions, Enid began connecting reform-minded Irish intellectuals with colonial thinkers she had met in London, men from India, Egypt, and South Africa, who were themselves grappling with questions of independence. They shared a common frustration that the empire spoke of civilization while enforcing obedience. In Enid's salons at the Kenmare estate, such discussions unfolded over tea and candlelight. The conversations were careful, their tone diplomatic, but beneath the civility ran an electric current of change. Some of the guests, poets, priests, and professors, would later recall those evenings as their first glimpse of a different world, one where equality might be imagined not as rebellion but as evolution. Valentine, though cautious, admired her conviction. He, too, was weary of the old order, though his weariness came from regret rather than vision. "You make it sound so simple," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, rain tapping the windows. "To give back what generations have taken, it is not only policy, it is memory." She smiled softly. "Then let memory begin again," she said. "Empires are only stories told by the victors. Perhaps it's time to tell new ones." He reached for her hand, the gesture both tender and resigned, as though he knew she would one day belong more to history than to him. For Enid, Ireland became a mirror of the empire itself, a place divided by language, faith, and loss. She visited villages where children went barefoot, their parents still paying rent on land their ancestors had tilled for centuries. She spoke with priests and schoolmasters who dreamed of a nation free of both crown and hunger. In those moments, she understood that reform required more than compassion. It required imagination. "A nation cannot be handed freedom like a key," she wrote in her diary. "It must learn the shape of the lock." Her observations grew sharper, her tone more deliberate. The quiet colonial girl who had once questioned the lines on a map now saw how those lines cut through lives. But influence, especially in a world ruled by men, came at a price. Whispers began to circulate in drawing rooms that Lady Kenmare had gone native, that her sympathies were unbecoming of her station. Invitations waned. Some of Valentine's peers advised him to curb her eccentricities. Yet the Earl, bound by both admiration and fatigue, chose silence over scolding. In truth, he found in her a vitality that reignited his own sense of purpose. Together they began to host what Enid called the Evenings of Understanding, small gatherings that brought together Irish landlords and tenant representatives under one roof. The discussions were tense, often unproductive, but sometimes, miraculously, they ended not in argument, but in understanding. For Enid, That was enough. Every word of peace, she told Valentine, is a thread in the unraveling of empire. In the summers, she traveled back to London, where she moved among the tired aristocracy, like a spirit from another age. The capital, once magnificent in its confidence, now seemed to her like a stage set after the actors had gone home. Impressive, but empty. The salons she attended were filled with men speaking of reconstruction while clinging to the ghosts of empire. Enid, ever the observer, smiled and listened, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. She began to fund small scholarships for colonial students at British universities, insisting that knowledge must no longer flow in only one direction. If the empire taught the colonies how to read, she remarked once, then it must also learn how to listen. In the quiet of the Irish countryside, as the war's echoes faded and Europe sought to heal, Enid Lindeman Kenmare found a new rhythm to her life, one of purpose disguised as leisure, rebellion disguised as grace. She no longer thought in terms of nations or titles, but of people, of stories, of voices long ignored. She began drafting essays, unsigned, published anonymously in progressive journals, that questioned the moral foundations of imperial rule. An empire, she wrote under the pseudonym E.L.K., cannot endure if it forgets that its subjects are not shadows, but souls. Few readers knew the author's identity, but those who did admired her audacity. Among reformists, she became a quiet legend, the titled lady who spoke with the fire of the dispossessed. When the Earl fell ill in 1922, Enid nursed him with devotion. Their final conversation, as imagined in this retelling, was one of both love and prophecy. "You will outlive me," he said weakly, "and when you do, promise me you will not stop speaking." She touched his hand gently. "No," she whispered. "I will not stop until someone listens." When he passed, she closed the curtains and sat in silence, not out of despair, but contemplation. She had loved him not for his title, but for his willingness to see her as more than his reflection. In his death, she inherited not only his wealth, but his credibility, an open door into circles of influence she now intended to use. Beneath the dance of titles, new lines were. The year was 1922, and Europe was still learning to breathe again. From the ashes of war rose both disillusionment and beauty, jazz spilling from cellar doors, art defying tradition, poets burning their certainties like offerings to a restless age. Into this atmosphere of reinvention came Enid Lindeman Kenmare, now twice widowed, her reputation as luminous as it was enigmatic. She arrived in Paris with trunks of silk gowns and the kind of sadness that only freedom can bring. The city received her not as an exile but as a mystery. They called her La Veuve d'Empire, the widow of empire, for wherever she went, the echoes of a world that had once ruled still followed in her wake. Paris had always been a city of experiment, and Enid found in its chaos a strange kind of order. Her townhouse on the left bank became both refuge and forum. Artists, exiles, and intellectuals drifted through its doors, drawn not by her fortune but by the serenity with which she listened. Among her guests were the bright stars of the new age, Hemingway in his youth, Cocteau with his cigarette holder, and the restless Josephine Baker, dancing between performance and protest. Yet, unlike the others who sought to escape history through art, Enid sought to confront it through conversation. The trauma of the war had left Europe hollow, and she sensed that amid the laughter and champagne, a deeper question lingered. What should replace the empires that had fallen? Now, in this reimagined world, Enid's Paris salon becomes a crucible of ideas. She invites Indian nationalists, African intellectuals, Irish poets, and Arab reformers to dine together beneath her painted ceilings. The air is thick with tobacco and contradiction. They argue in French, English, and Arabic about freedom, race, and the meaning of civilization. Enid moderates with the grace of a conductor, her voice soft but decisive. Empires, she tells them, do not end when the flags change. They end when the minds of men learn equality. Her words, carried later in letters and memoirs, would inspire a generation of post-war thinkers who believed that independence without understanding was merely another form of servitude. But not all in Paris saw her as a visionary. To many in the expatriate community, she was a curiosity, a woman of wealth dabbling in dangerous ideas. Some accused her of romanticizing revolution, of entertaining radicals for amusement. Yet beneath their derision lay unease, for she represented something they could neither dismiss nor control, a woman of privilege who refused to stay within its boundaries. Her beauty remained her armor, but her intellect was now her sword. She wrote essays, still unsigned, calling for a covenant of equals, a voluntary union of nations that would replace domination with dialogue. Her proposal circulated among academics and journalists, dismissed by most as idealism. But in this alternate world, her words find sympathetic readers in unlikely places. A young Indian lawyer named Nehru, an African editor in Lagos, an Irish statesman rebuilding after revolution. To them, her voice was not naive, it was prophetic. Her Paris years were rich in conversation, but poor in peace. For all her influence, Enid lived with the loneliness of one who sees too clearly. She moved among people, but belonged to none of them. The city glittered around her, yet she often sat awake until dawn, her hands resting on letters she would never send. Sometimes she walked along the Seine at night, watching the reflections of the bridges tremble in the current. The river reminded her of time, beautiful, indifferent, always moving forward. Paris, she once wrote to a friend, is a mirror that flatters and deceives. It reflects what we wish to be, not what we are. Her wealth, though considerable, began to thin. Investments faltered, and her generosity to the causes she supported left her finances precarious. Yet she refused to retreat into safety. When the British embassy subtly warned her to temper her public views, she replied, "If silence is loyalty, then I must betray." It was around this time that she earned a new nickname among those who feared her influence, the Colonial Duchess. They meant it as mockery, but she wore it as a title of defiance. "If I am a Duchess of Colonies," she told a journalist with a wry smile, "then perhaps I should start behaving like one." And behave she did. In our imagined timeline, she convenes in 1924 what would later be whispered about as the Paris Table, a private gathering of 20 thinkers from across the empire. Their goal, to draft a vision of governance not bound by imperial hierarchy, but by mutual responsibility. It was not a treaty, not even a manifesto, but something subtler, a statement of moral intent, written in prose rather than policy. Let nations, it said, relate as individuals in friendship, not as masters in commerce. Though never published, copies found their way to the libraries of Cambridge, Delhi, and Alexandria. Years later, fragments of its language would echo faintly in the founding documents of the United Nations, though its author's name was long forgotten. Yet vision alone cannot sustain a heart. Beneath her public poise, Enid felt the weariness of one who bears a burden too abstract for the world to notice. The salons that had once thrilled her now seemed repetitive, the laughter forced, the conversations circling like smoke. The younger generation of Paris artists, lost boys and restless women, mocked her idealism. "You still believe in causes?" one of them asked. "The only truth left is the self." She replied, "And yet the self cannot breathe alone." It was around this time that she met an old friend of Valentine's, a British diplomat who had served in Cairo and was now posted to Geneva. Through him, she began to correspond with statesmen involved in the League of Nations. Her letters, written in flawless French and discreetly signed with initials, argued that peace required not only treaties, but empathy. "The empire is dying," she wrote, "but its ghost will haunt the world unless it learns humility." Some of her suggestions, particularly regarding colonial representation, were discussed in committee, though never adopted. Still, she took quiet satisfaction in knowing her words had entered the bloodstream of diplomacy, however faintly. Her health began to decline in the late 1920s, worn by years of restless travel and emotional solitude. Friends noticed her growing frailty, but she dismissed concern with a smile. "I am not ill," she would say, "only unfinished." The line would later be quoted in a memoir by one of her acquaintances, who claimed it was the most beautiful description of longing he had ever heard. By 1928, she was spending her days mostly at home, reading newspapers from Cairo and Calcutta, circling articles in ink, her mind still alive with the possibilities of a world not yet realized. In this reimagined history, her vision of equality does not die in obscurity. It germinates quietly in the minds of those who pass through her salon, carried across oceans, in letters and memories. The African student who once debated her in Paris would later write that she was the first white woman who spoke of empire as a wound, not a crown. Yet Enid herself remained unaware of her influence. To her, it felt as though she had failed. One evening in 1929, as the world's markets began to crumble, she stood on her balcony overlooking the Seine. The city was silent, its usual hum subdued by the chill of uncertainty. She thought of Valentine, of Roderick, of the soldiers she had nursed, of the countless unnamed faces she had tried to speak for. The lights along the river flickered as though the city itself were sighing. "Perhaps," she whispered into the night, "the dream was too heavy for one heart." Below, the water flowed endlessly, calm, indifferent. It was in the spring of 1928 when the lilacs returned to London, and the city pretended, as it often did, that the world was not unraveling, that Enid Lindeman Kenmare crossed paths with Winston Churchill. The encounter took place at a dinner hosted by Lady Astor, in a Mayfair house gleaming with chandeliers and conversation. The air was thick with politics, cigar smoke, and the scent of ambition. Churchill, not yet the lion of wartime legend, but still a formidable presence, had just returned from a lecture tour defending the British Empire as the moral spine of civilization. Enid, ever the quiet observer, listened with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. When they were introduced, his gaze met hers with the curiosity of a man accustomed to being admired. "Lady Kenmare," he said, "I hear you are the Empire's most beautiful critic." She replied, "Then we are both guilty of loving what we wish to correct." Their first exchange was polite, even charming, but beneath it lay the tension of two visions destined to collide. Over the following months, their paths crossed often, at luncheons, in drawing rooms, at political gatherings, where the future of the empire was debated like a chess game played by ghosts. Churchill spoke with the confidence of heritage, invoking the duty of the British to guide the lesser nations. Enid countered with the calm of experience, asking whether guidance could exist without consent. He was accustomed to argument but unaccustomed to being challenged by a woman who neither sought favor nor feared offense. Yet he could not dismiss her. There was something in her tone, measured, unhurried, devoid of bitterness, that forced even the most hardened imperialist to pause. In our alternate history, what began as a sparring of words grew into a correspondence of consequence. After that first evening, Churchill sent her a note, half flattery, half invitation, to dine privately and continue their debate. She accepted, though not without amusement. Their meetings became a peculiar ritual. He would arrive with statistics and speeches, she with questions that unseated his certainties. "You speak of empire as destiny," she told him once, as they sat beside a fire in his Chartwell study, "but destiny is the word we use when we have run out of imagination." He leaned forward, intrigued. "And what would you replace it with?" "Empathy," she said simply. "The courage to see the world as others live it, not only as we govern it." He laughed, but softly, not dismissively. In time, her words began to echo in his own reflections, though he never admitted it. Their letters, exchanged over several years, became a record of their ideological duel. In them, Enid's tone was precise, her pen both tender and uncompromising. She wrote of Cairo and Calcutta, of the Irish fields she had walked after the famine, of the wounds that power disguised as progress. The British Empire, she wrote in one letter preserved only in fragments, is a magnificent ship built for conquest, now sailing without a compass. Its captain confuses noise for direction. Churchill replied with wit and eloquence, arguing that without Britain's order, the world would descend into chaos. Then perhaps, she wrote back, the world needs to learn to navigate its own storms. In private, he admired her. In public, he avoided mentioning her name, for she represented a kind of dissent too elegant to attack and too dangerous to acknowledge. Their exchanges were not romantic in the conventional sense, yet there was an intimacy in the way they argued, a meeting of minds that left both unsettled. Friends of Churchill noticed that he sometimes quoted her ideas, though altered to fit his own rhetoric. He spoke more frequently of partnership with an empire and the moral responsibility of governance, concepts that bore the faint fragrance of her influence. Enid, for her part, felt both satisfaction and sorrow. "He listens," she confided to her journal, "but only to shape my truth into his own defense." During these years, London began to change around them. The roaring 20s were fading into the gray of economic unease. Factories closed, unemployment rose, and even the aristocracy felt the tremor of instability. Enid observed with quiet intensity how swiftly the empire's confidence could erode. She began to advocate more openly for reform, giving small talks at universities under pseudonyms. Her message was consistent. If the empire is to survive, it must learn equality not as a gift, but as a habit. To those who heard her speak, she seemed less like a socialite and more like a prophet out of step with her time. In this imagined timeline, her reputation among the political elite grew paradoxically larger and more shadowed. Some saw her as a visionary, others as a threat. Letters addressed to her began arriving without signatures. Pleas from Indian students, African clerks, Irish teachers, each thanking her for giving voice to what they could not say aloud. She read every one and kept them in a carved wooden box, which she called "My True Inheritance." Each letter confirmed what she had long suspected, that history's pulse beat loudest in the hearts of those unheard. It was during one of her last meetings with Churchill in the summer of 1930 that their dialogue reached its most profound turning. They were seated on the terrace of a country house overlooking the Kentish hills, the air thick with the hum of bees and the faint rumble of approaching thunder. "You dream of dissolving the empire," he said with a hint of melancholy. "Do you not see that it has given order to the world?" She gazed across the fields, her voice barely above a whisper. "Order, yes, but at the cost of wonder. You have taught nations to obey but not to dream. An empire that forgets imagination will one day govern only ashes." He turned away, struck by the quiet certainty in her words. For a moment the orator had no reply. The thunder broke at last, distant but inevitable, and rain began to fall between them. She rose to leave, offering her hand. "Do not mistake me, Winston," she said. "I do not wish to destroy your empire. I only wish to wake it." From then on, their correspondence became less frequent, but more poignant. He wrote to her once after a long silence, "You are the only person who has ever made me question whether victory and virtue are the same thing." She replied, "Then my work is done, even if the world never knows it." The letters would later be found among her papers, many unsigned, some unfinished, as though the conversation had never truly ended. By the time the 1930s deepened into crisis, Enid had already turned her gaze elsewhere, to the colonies themselves, where the ideas she had nurtured might yet take root. Her exchanges with Churchill had shown her both the reach and the limits of persuasion. Power, she understood now, does not yield to charm alone. It requires endurance, and sometimes exile. As she prepared to leave for Egypt, she packed away the last of his letters, tied them with a silk ribbon, and placed them in the same wooden box that held her letters from strangers. "Words," she murmured, "are the only empire worth keeping." From then on, their correspondence was a quiet war. By the early 1930s, the world had grown unsteady again. The promises of peace that followed the Great War had curdled into hunger, unemployment, and the slow decay of old certainties. In the cafes of Paris, despair was intellectual. In the streets of Cairo and Delhi, it was practical, raw, and defiant. It was into this restless age that Enid Lindeman, now in her 40s and thrice transformed by life, stepped once more into the current of history. The city of London had grown cold to her, its salons dulled by economic fear. But Enid was not made for retreat. Her mind, trained in loss, tempered by conversation with the powerful, had begun to turn towards something larger than reform. She now sought influence not as ornament, but as instrument, and as though fate itself recognized her readiness, a new companion appeared. Brigadier General Frederick Cavendish, a soldier with the bearing of authority and the quiet heart of a man who had seen too much. Frederick was not a man of philosophy. He had served across the empire, from the trenches of France to the sands of Egypt, and carried the air of one who obeyed because disobedience had never been offered as an option. But he admired intelligence, and Enid's fascinated him. They met at a reception for military officers returning from service in Sudan. While others discussed campaigns, she asked him what the desert taught him about silence. "That it speaks more honestly than governments," he said. They were married within a year, in a small ceremony that blended affection with alliance. For the first time, Enid saw that partnership could be a bridge to power, not merely a refuge from it. With Frederick's connections, doors that had once closed to her now opened, doors of ministries, embassies, and colonial offices. In this reimagined world, Enid learned to walk through them not as a guest, but as a listener. She charmed civil servants with warmth, then disarmed them with reason. Soon she became known among diplomatic circles as the Merchant of Influence, a phrase coined by a French ambassador who, half admiring, half wary, remarked that she trades in ideas as others trade in gold. What he did not know was that Enid's true commerce was empathy. She cultivated friendships across continents, speaking softly to those whom the empire ignored, giving advice to those too proud to ask for it. Her drawing room in Kensington became a crossroads of whispered diplomacy, where colonial reformers met discreetly with sympathetic officials. She was careful, always careful. The British establishment tolerated her because she never shouted. She moved through conversations with a calm precision, offering suggestions disguised as compliments, principles hidden within anecdotes. "One must learn," she told Frederick, "to plant questions rather than answers. Answers invite defense, but questions invite memory." It was a lesson she had refined in her exchanges with Churchill, and now she wielded it with mastery. Through her introductions, tentative channels formed between colonial movements and London's reformists. The effect was subtle but real, a letter here, a sympathetic ear there, and though history would not record her hand in it, the slow thaw of imperial arrogance owed more to her persuasion than to any speech made in Parliament. Frederick watched her work with a mixture of pride and unease. He admired her mind, but feared for her safety in a world where opinion could ruin more swiftly than illness. "You move too close to the fire," he warned once. She smiled gently, brushing the dust from his sleeve. "My dear, I was born in its light. I only wish to understand its warmth before it burns the rest of us." He could not answer her then. Like many men of his generation, he sensed that the world was changing, but could not yet imagine its new shape. Enid, however, could. She saw the signs everywhere, in the uprisings in India, the protests in Cairo, the Irish Free State's uneasy independence. The map of empire, once so certain, was beginning to tremble. In 1932, the couple traveled to Egypt, where Frederick was assigned as an advisor to the British garrison. For Enid, the journey was more than a change of scenery. It was a pilgrimage to the heart of empire's contradictions. Cairo was a city of opposites, call to prayer and church bells, camels and motor cars, poverty and perfume. She adored it instantly. From her balcony overlooking the Nile, she watched the feluccas glide beneath the sunset and thought of how geography itself seemed to defy obedience. Perhaps, she wrote in her journal, the world is tired of lines. Perhaps rivers and winds have more sense than men. Her salon in Cairo became what it had once been in Paris, a sanctuary for the eloquent and the exiled. Egyptian reformers, British officers, poets and princesses all came to drink her coffee and trade their truths. Among them was the feminist leader Huda Sha'arawi, whose unveiled face symbolized a nation's awakening. The two women, though different in origin, recognized in each other a shared defiance of boundaries. They spent long evenings together discussing the future of women, the nature of faith, and the illusions of civilization. Empires, Huda told her, do not fall. They crumble from neglect of the heart. Enid nodded. Then perhaps women must teach the heart again. In that imagined Cairo summer, they conceived a daring idea, a network of women across nations, a commonwealth of women, bound not by empire but by understanding. It was less a plan than a vision, but it lived in Enid's mind thereafter as a quiet promise to the future. Word of her gatherings reached the British residency, and soon whispers began. Some called her dangerous, others dismissed her as eccentric. Yet the High Commissioner himself, curious about the influence she was rumored to wield, invited her to tea. "Lady Cavendish," he said with a thin smile, "you seem to have made quite the impression on both natives and nobility." She returned the smile without hesitation. "Then I am merely serving the purpose of empire, am I not? Bringing people together." He chuckled, uncertain whether she mocked him, but the conversation ended politely. Still, she understood the warning beneath his civility. From that day, she took greater care, speaking less in public and more through trusted intermediaries. Her correspondence now spanned continents. Letters arrived from Delhi, Dublin, Accra. Testimonies of movements stirring beneath the empire's calm exterior. She read them by candlelight, her heart lifted and burdened in equal measure. She knew her position was precarious, that influence purchased through privilege was fragile, conditional, yet she persisted. "If I am tolerated because of my name," she wrote to a friend, "then let my name work while it still can. A woman may not command armies, but she may move the tide with a whisper." But whispers have their cost. As her influence grew, so too did her isolation. The friends of her youth could no longer understand her, and the reformers she helped could not trust her fully, for she remained, after all, the embodiment of the empire they opposed. Her evenings ended more often in silence now, the lamps flickering over a table littered with letters. Frederick, ever loyal, watched her with concern, sensing that the woman he loved was drifting further into realms he could not follow. "You fight battles with words," he said, "but words can wound as surely as bullets." She looked up from her papers and answered, "Yes, but they can also heal." In this alternate world, history would later remember her Cairo years as her most powerful, yet most lonely. For all her success in connecting people and ideas, she began to understand that true change could not be owned. It could only be inspired. An inspiration is a flame that consumes even as it lights the way. When she looked into the mirror now, she no longer saw the radiant beauty that had once turned heads in London. She saw a woman made luminous by purpose and shadowed by fatigue. The desert winds grew stronger that year, and in them she sometimes imagined she heard voices. Those of the soldiers she had nursed, the lovers she had lost, the strangers who had written to her from across the empire. They seemed to whisper not gratitude, but persistence. Power, she realized at last. The summer of 1933 settled over Egypt like a slow exhalation, heavy with dust and gold. The heat rose from the stones of Cairo and blurred the horizon into trembling illusion, where the city seemed to shimmer between centuries. In this suspended world, Enid Lindeman Cavendish lived as both guest and witness, her life unfolding beneath the long, unblinking sun. She loved the city not for its grandeur, but for its contradictions. Cairo was restless, layered, a living mosaic of memory. The muezzin's call drifted across rooftops that once housed conquerors and scholars alike, and every street seemed to hold a story that had survived empires. "Here," she wrote to a friend in London, "time does not march, it circles." By day she was the attentive wife of a British brigadier, moving through polite colonial society with impeccable manners. By night she was something far less ordinary. Her home on the Garden City waterfront became a quiet sanctuary where women of every nationality gathered behind drawn curtains. There were Egyptian teachers, British doctors, Sudanese writers, and even the occasional French journalist, each drawn by the magnetic calm of her presence. Huda Sha'arawi came often, her voice low but resolute as she spoke of education and equality. Together, she and Enid began to imagine a new kind of fraternity, not of men and power, but of women and empathy. It was not political in the formal sense. There were no declarations, no votes. Instead, there was listening, a rare form of diplomacy in an age addicted to command. They called it, almost playfully, the Commonwealth of Women. Their meetings were secret, though not clandestine. Cairo's British circles regarded Enid's soirees as curiosities, harmless eccentricities of a wealthy widow. Few guessed that, over tea and laughter, she was hosting the beginnings of a quiet revolution. The women spoke of schools and rights, of laws written by those who never bore their consequences, of the exhaustion of being perpetually silent. Enid rarely led the conversations. She guided them, allowing ideas to find their own gravity. "Empires fall," she said once, "when they cease to understand their daughters." It was a sentiment that lingered in the air long after the lamps were extinguished. Yet beneath her serenity, Enid sensed danger. Egypt was changing. The monarchy tottered between nationalism and foreign control, and whispers of rebellion wound through the bazaars like smoke. British officials grew wary of gatherings they could not control. One evening, Frederick returned home visibly troubled. "You are being watched," he said quietly, setting his hat upon the table. "The Residency believes you are consorting with agitators." Enid met his eyes without surprise. If justice is agitation, then perhaps they are right. He sighed, loving her still but weary of her courage. "You do not understand how brittle this world is," he said. "You cannot touch it without breaking it." "Then let it break," she replied. "Something living may yet grow from the pieces." Her defiance was never theatrical. She did not speak to crowds, did not write manifestos. Her rebellion was one of atmosphere, of presence. People changed after spending time with her. They left her house more certain of their humanity and less afraid of their power. Even the servants who once regarded her as a figure of elegance beyond reach began to approach her with trust. She learned their names, their children's dreams, their fears of hunger. "Every empire," she wrote in her journal, "rests on invisible shoulders. The tragedy is that those shoulders are never seen." As the heat deepened, Cairo began to feel like a threshold. The old empire still stood, but its shadow was thinning. Riots flared sporadically, and each time Enid heard the distant echo of gunfire, she thought of London and the conversations she had shared with Churchill. She had told him once that domination could not outlast exhaustion, and now she saw proof in the trembling streets. Still, her affection for Britain had not vanished. It had only matured into something more honest, stripped of illusion. She no longer sought to save the empire. She wished only to redeem its conscience before it was too late. Frederick, loyal to his duty, remained torn between admiration and apprehension. He loved his wife, but he could not deny that her influence stretched further than his command. His fellow officers muttered quietly, calling her the Pharaoh's lady or the diplomat in pearls. Yet even they came to her when trouble stirred, for her intuition often foresaw what official intelligence missed. She predicted protests before they erupted, reconciled quarrels between local leaders and the garrison, and once, through sheer charm, averted a diplomatic scandal when a young lieutenant insulted an Egyptian minister. "You are wasted on society," Frederick told her that night. "You were meant for history." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps," she said, "but history has never had much patience for women." The years in Egypt softened and sharpened her in equal measure. The desert taught her humility, its silence, patience. At dawn, she would ride beyond the city, where the air was cool and the horizon seemed infinite. From there, she could see both the pyramids and the modern skyline, ancient permanence facing fragile ambition. It was then she began to think more deeply about time itself. "Civilizations," she noted in a letter to a friend, "are not built upon conquest, but upon the endurance of compassion. When compassion ends, so does civilization." Her words would later be quoted, unattributed, by scholars studying the psychology of empire. In our timeline, they vanish into obscurity. In this one, they survive as part of her growing legend. But even legends must pay their price. The more she saw, the more she felt the quiet ache of futility. For every reformer inspired, there were 10 cynics waiting to undo the work. The British authorities continued to tighten their hold, and nationalism, once noble, began to harden into suspicion. The unity she had glimpsed between peoples felt fragile again, threatened by pride and politics. Still, she refused despair. "Progress," she told Huda one evening as the call to prayer drifted across the Nile, "is not a line, but a circle. We return to what we do not finish." Her marriage, though affectionate, began to carry the weight of two diverging worlds. Frederick sought order. Enid sought meaning. He lived by command. She lived by persuasion. Yet he loved her loyalty, her patience, the calm in her voice when the news from Europe grew dark again. "If the world breaks," she told him, "promise me you'll stand where the pieces meet." He promised, though he did not yet understand what she foresaw. By 1935, the winds of history had begun to shift once more. Fascism was rising in Europe, the colonies were stirring, and the empire she had spent her life questioning now stood like an aging monument, beautiful but cracking. Enid watched the evening sun dissolve into the river, turning it to molten gold. The reflection dazzled her eyes, yet she did not look away. "All empires end," she whispered, "but perhaps their light need not die with them." When the telegram arrived in the spring of 1936, the Cairo air was already heavy with sand and the smell of coming heat. Enid stood at the veranda railing, the envelope in her hand, its edges trembling slightly in the wind. The message was brief, merciless in its efficiency. "Brigadier Cavendish taken ill. Heart. No recovery." She read it twice before lowering it to her side, her eyes fixed upon the slow current of the Nile. The world seemed to pause. She'd always imagined she would face widowhood again, but not like this, not in a land so far from the green hills of Ireland or the polished stone of London. Frederick had been her ally, her shield against the whispers that followed her across continents. Now the shield was gone, and only the whisper remained. Grief, for Enid, had always been a private geography. She did not weep publicly, nor seek sympathy. She packed her life with quiet precision, as if folding memory itself into trunks, and left Cairo by train within the week. As she watched the desert blur past the window, she reflected that she had lived a lifetime in that city, a lifetime of learning that influence was a mirage unless anchored by courage. The dunes stretched endlessly, pale as parchment, and she thought, this is how power ends, not with loss, but with stillness. When she reached the Mediterranean, she boarded a ship bound for Europe, its decks crowded with diplomats and officers escaping the rising tensions in the east. She stood among them at dusk, the horizon faint and colorless, and wondered what awaited her now that every great cause seemed to be collapsing under the weight of its own certainty. London welcomed her as if she had never left, though the city itself had changed. The music was quieter, the optimism of the 1920s long extinguished by fear of another war. Fascist rallies echoed across the continent, and even the English press spoke uneasily of alliances and inevitabilities. Enid returned to her townhouse in Belgravia, now sparsely furnished and shadowed by absence. She found solace not in company, but in correspondence, reopening the network of thinkers and friends she had built over the past 2 decades. Letters arrived from Cairo, from Dublin, from Delhi, each bearing both affection and alarm. The colonial world, she saw, was waking faster than Britain wished to admit. They will not wait for permission, she wrote in her journal, and they should not. Freedom delayed is not peace. It is a longer kind of war. Her own circle of acquaintances had shifted. Many of her old allies were gone or silent, and those who remained were cautious, watching the darkening horizon of Europe. Yet Enid found herself in quiet demand once again. Diplomats, journalists, and even a few politicians sought her opinion, not publicly, but over discreet lunches or late-night telephone calls. She offered no radical manifestos, only a wisdom too grounded to dismiss. The empire must evolve, she told one official. The alternative is to vanish beneath its own pride. He nodded, taking notes he would later hide in his drawer, unsure whether to quote or forget her. In this reimagined history, her influence during those years is subtle but profound. When the Foreign Office debated the question of colonial representation within the League of Nations, it was her memorandum, unsigned, circulated privately, that argued for inclusion. She wrote of the moral exhaustion of ownership, of the need for Britain to lead by surrendering power rather than hoarding it. Her words reached a handful of sympathetic ears, but went no further. "You are ahead of your time," a civil servant wrote to her. She replied, "That is merely another way of saying I will not be heard." Still, she did not retreat. She began to host small gatherings again, though they bore little resemblance to the salons of her youth. Her guests were fewer now, older, wearier, academics, poets, and refugees who had fled regimes that hated thought. They came for her conversation, for the serenity of her voice, for the way she could listen without interruption. In her drawing room, surrounded by portraits of lost friends and faded maps, she created what one visitor called a parliament of memory. It was not power she sought anymore, but connection. A sense that ideas, even unfulfilled, could remain alive through the act of being shared. And yet, for all her calm, loneliness had begun to whisper again. In quiet hours, she thought of Frederick's steady patience, of Valentine's melancholy, of Roderick's forgotten laughter. She thought, too, of Winston Churchill, whose name once again filled newspapers as he warned of Germany's growing menace. She wondered if he remembered their debates, their long letters about the destiny of empires. Perhaps he did. Perhaps her words lay somewhere among his papers, unacknowledged, but not forgotten. "It is the fate of women," she once said to a friend, "to build bridges that others cross without noticing who laid the first stone." The shadow of war grew longer. By 1938, the word inevitable returned to public speech. London streets filled with marches, the newspapers with photographs of flags and armies. Enid, now in her mid-40s, sensed history gathering itself for another blow. She no longer believed in the permanence of nations, only in the resilience of people. When Munich was declared a triumph of peace, she attended a dinner where men toasted to stability and sighed with relief. She raised her glass quietly, her expression unreadable. "Peace," she murmured, "is not the absence of threat, but the presence of understanding. We have the first. We lack the second." Her remark passed unheard in the noise of celebration. After Frederick's death, she was again a woman without anchor, yet not adrift. She began to write essays for small journals under a pseudonym, meditations on power, forgiveness, and belonging. They were not overtly political, but carried a moral gravity that readers found haunting. One, titled On the End of Maps, argued that humanity's next challenge would not be to conquer land, but to rediscover meaning in a world without boundaries. The essay was quietly circulated among the British intelligentsia, even quoted in speeches though never attributed to her. She took satisfaction in that anonymity. "To shape thought without recognition," she wrote, "is the truest form of influence." The late 1930s found her thinner, her beauty softened into grace. She lived modestly, her fortune diminished by years of philanthropy and loss, yet there was still a light about her. One friend described it as a patience that felt like faith. She spent evenings listening to the wireless, her hands folded around a cup of tea, as voices from across Europe warned of the storm to come. When the German tanks rolled into Poland, she did not cry or curse. She simply whispered, "So the map turns again," and began to prepare herself for another chapter of endurance. She no longer hoped to prevent catastrophe. She hoped only to give it meaning. The world had broken twice in her lifetime, and she had learned that the fragments, once gathered, could build something unexpected. Her generation had drawn the lines of empire. Perhaps hers could learn how to erase them. As the blackout curtains were drawn across London, Enid lit a single candle by her window, as she always did in times of uncertainty. She watched its flame tremble, its light small but stubborn against the dark. The lights dimmed. The winter of 1939 fell over Europe like a drawn breath that refused to release. The streets of London, muffled in blackout cloth, were a maze of anxiety and discipline. People spoke in murmurs, as if loudness itself might draw the attention of bombs yet to come. Enid Lindeman Cavendish, by then accustomed to the long shadows of history, moved through this twilight world with the composure of someone who had seen the end of certainty too many times to fear its return. It was during these uneasy months that she met the man who would become both her companion and her final challenge. Baron Hermann von Dinklage, a German diplomat posted briefly in France, whose charm concealed the machinery of a darker allegiance. In our known history, Dinklage was an agent of Nazi intelligence, a man of elegance and duplicity who would later become infamous. But in this imagined turning of time, their meeting takes on a different contour, less accident, more convergence. Enid met him in Geneva, at a humanitarian conference convened in the fragile hope of preventing yet another war. She attended not as a delegate, but as an observer, invited for her reputation as a thinker and hostess of influence. The Baron approached her after a session on the ethics of colonial governance, a topic she had long championed. "Lady Cavendish," he said, bowing slightly, "you speak of justice as if it were inevitable. Surely you know it is only ever permitted." She regarded him calmly. "Perhaps," she replied, "but permission has never stopped me." The conversation continued over coffee, then dinner, and before the week's end, a correspondence had begun. Letters carried across borders now trembling on the brink of chaos. The attraction between them was intellectual first, then emotional, and finally something more dangerous. Dinklage, worldly and persuasive, spoke of a new order rising from Europe's discontent, a world that would dispense with the old hypocrisies of empire and replace them with efficiency and will. Enid listened with patience, but beneath her poise, her heart chilled. She recognized in his words the echo of every empire she had ever questioned, the same conviction that one people might perfect the world by ruling it. Yet she did not condemn him outright. She had learned that fanaticism could not be defeated by outrage, only by understanding. "You think you are destroying the old tyranny," she told him one night, "but you are only repainting its mask." He smiled faintly, unfazed. "And you, my lady, think empathy can change men's hearts. It cannot. Only power does that." She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Then you have never truly seen power." Their relationship unfolded in secrecy as war's first thunder rolled across Europe. When Paris fell in 1940, Enid followed him there, drawn by something between fascination and duty. She knew what he was, a man loyal to a government that turned ideology into cruelty. But she believed still in her ability to temper him, to reach whatever remnants of conscience he had not yet surrendered. In this alternate history, her role in Paris is not that of a passive lover, but of a subtle double agent, navigating a perilous balance between affection and resistance. Through the salons she reopened in the occupied city, she gathered diplomats, writers, and officers who, knowingly or not, became part of her quiet network. Her gatherings were elegant illusions, veiled operations conducted under the guise of civility. Over wine and candlelight, information passed like glances, and secrets changed hands without the sound of a word. Paris in wartime was a ghost in silk. The once vivid cafes burned dimly under curfew, and music, when it came, sounded haunted, as if aware of its own fragility. Enid moved through this world with the practiced grace of someone both invisible and indispensable. To the German officers, she was a charming widow whose affection for the Baron lent her a convenient aura of loyalty. To the resistance, she became an unnamed ally, a messenger, a protector, a quiet channel through which warnings flowed to those in danger. It was she who arranged safe passage for a handful of Jewish intellectuals to escape to Switzerland. Her signature hidden behind diplomatic forms, she persuaded Dinklage to sign. She never lied to him outright, but she told truths so carefully chosen that they became their own kind of disguise. There were nights when she wondered whether she was deceiving him or herself. The Baron was not a monster in manner. He was intelligent, weary, and occasionally kind. He spoke to her of art, of Goethe, of the futility of weakness. "The strong shape history," he told her once as the sirens wailed outside, "and the weak endure it." She looked out the window at the curfewed streets, then back at him. "You mistake endurance for weakness," she said softly. "It is endurance that survives empires." In that moment, something flickered in his expression, uncertainty, perhaps even respect. She would later wonder whether he knew all along that she was working against him and chose to let her continue for reasons of his own. Their relationship became a bargain neither could name. She offered him affection that might have been truth, and he offered her access that might have been permission. Her Paris home during those years was a study in contrasts, laughter masking fear, conversation concealing conspiracy. She dressed impeccably, her elegance her camouflage, her charm her weapon. Each night she lit a single candle in the window, a signal to those who knew that her house remained a place of safety. The resistance called her La Dame des Cartes, the Lady of Maps, because of the coded messages she sent disguised as travel itineraries and dinner menus. She never sought recognition. She understood that her power depended upon her invisibility. When the Gestapo began to suspect her, she turned suspicion into performance, hosting ever more extravagant dinners, inviting officers to bask in her company. Her defiance was made of poise, yet beneath the surface of control, the toll was immense. The strain of secrecy, the daily masquerade of charm, began to erode her strength. Her health, always delicate, faltered. Friends vanished overnight. The sound of boots on cobblestone became the city's heartbeat. Some nights, when the curfew sirens moaned through the fog, she would sit alone before the mirror, removing her jewelry slowly as though undressing from history itself. "There is no courage without sorrow," she wrote in one of her last journals. "Only those who have lost everything can afford to speak truth." The Baron, for all his power, began to sense the empire he served was rotting from within. His letters to Berlin grew hesitant, his loyalty more measured. Whether this was love's influence or simple fatigue, Enid never asked. She had learned that to demand confession was to break the fragile truce that kept them alive. What they shared, whatever it was, became a form of mutual forgiveness. Two people trapped within opposing myths, each trying to save the other from the ruins they were helping to build. When the Allied forces advanced toward Paris, Enid knew her time there was ending. The city prepared to change hands again, and with it the fates of those who had lived too long in its shadows. She destroyed her papers, burned her correspondence, and packed what few possessions she valued: the compass her father had given her, her diaries, and the wooden box of letters that had followed her from Cairo. She told Dinklage she would not stay for the reckoning. He did not try to stop her. "History will not forgive us," he said quietly. "History," she answered, "forgives nothing. It only forgets." She left Paris before the liberation, slipping away in the early hours, the city still half asleep under occupation. As the train carried her south toward the border, she looked back once at the dim glow of the streets and thought of the countless lives hidden beneath its rooftops, the voices silenced and the courage unseen. "Every night," she murmured to herself, "I lit a candle knowing it might burn my name." But perhaps by 1942, the war had swallowed the map whole. Europe was not a collection of nations now, but a wound that stretched from ocean to steppe. In London, the bombs had ceased for a time, yet the air still carried the taste of fear and the smell of burnt brick. Enid Lindeman, back from the ruins of Paris, found herself once again a widow, though this time the loss was not of a man but of illusion. The empire that had once shaped her youth was crumbling, its colonies restless, its conscience dimmed by exhaustion. She was nearing 50, and her beauty had faded into something more luminous, an austerity of presence that demanded silence when she entered a room. People still spoke her name in half-whispers, uncertain whether she was a heroine or a ghost. She lived quietly in a rented flat overlooking the Thames, a small apartment furnished with memory rather than comfort. Each evening she would sit by the window, watching the barges drift under the bridges, their lamps reflecting on the water like promises unkept. She was not idle, though she moved carefully, as if walking through a dream. The years in occupied Paris had left her with more than scars. They had left her with knowledge, a deep understanding of how power disguised itself in necessity. She no longer believed in the redemption of empire, but she had not abandoned hope for the redemption of humanity. "Nations," she wrote in her journal, "are like people. They sin, they repent, they forget. The task is to remind them, not to punish." It was during those uncertain months that she began to write again, though what she wrote was unlike anything she had ever attempted. It began as a letter, a long, unsent meditation addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. But as the days passed, it grew into a document she titled The Charter of Equal Nations. Its premise was both simple and audacious, that after the war, peace could not be built upon victory but upon parity. The colonial system, she argued, was not only unjust but unsustainable. Its continuation would guarantee another century of blood. "We must replace possession with partnership," she wrote, "and teach governance as service, not inheritance." She worked late into the night, the sound of air raid sirens rising and falling in the distance, her pen moving steadily as if guided by something beyond her own will. The charter was written not as a politician would write, but as a philosopher would pray. It blended idealism with experience, moral clarity with melancholy. "The empire is dying," she wrote, "but its death need not be cruel. Let it end as a teacher, laying down its books, not as a tyrant dragged from its throne." She wrote of Africa, of India, of the islands of the Pacific, lands she had never seen but had come to know through the letters and stories of those who lived under the empire's shadow. To each, she extended the same compassion. "Freedom," she wrote, "is not a gift to be granted, but a truth to be remembered." When she finished, the manuscript filled 70 pages, handwritten in her precise, elegant script. She knew it could not be published under her name. It was too bold, too damning of the system that still fed the machinery of Britain's government. So she did what she had always done. She worked through connection, persuasion, and silence. Through a friend at the Ministry of Information, she arranged for a typed copy to be sent, quietly and without attribution, to a diplomat she knew in Washington. That diplomat, intrigued by its eloquence, passed it along to an aide working in the circles around President Roosevelt's administration. From there, it reached one of the young idealists involved in the drafting of Allied war aims, a man who would later have a hand in shaping the post-war international order. Whether by chance or by destiny, Enid's words found their way into history's bloodstream. In this imagined world, her charter becomes a whisper that travels through corridors of power. Certain phrases, sovereign equality, shared humanity, collective peace, begin to appear in memoranda and speeches, unattributed but familiar. Roosevelt himself, when reading early proposals for what would one day become the United Nations Charter, paused over a sentence that read, "Peace cannot rest on the privileges of the powerful, but on the dignity of the equal." He circled it in pencil, murmuring, "Who wrote this?" No one could tell him, but the line remained. Meanwhile, in London, Enid continued her quiet labor. She corresponded with reformers in India and Africa under pseudonyms, offering moral support and occasionally financial help. She attended meetings of post-war planning committees under the guise of charity work, gently nudging conversations toward inclusion, toward acknowledgement of the colony's sacrifices. Those who met her were struck not by fervor, but by calm conviction. She spoke, one recalled, as if she had already forgiven us for what we had not yet done. Yet she never took credit. The charter remained unsigned, its author known only to a few trusted confidants. When one of them suggested she reveal herself after the war, she smiled faintly. "Names," she said, "belong to vanity. Ideas need no owner. Let them wander." Still, she kept one handwritten copy for herself, hidden in a leather folder alongside her father's compass and the few mementos of her past. She placed them together as though they belonged to the same journey. The war grew worse. London burned again, Paris suffered under occupation, and the news from the East was too terrible to bear. Enid endured these years like one who has already seen the pattern repeat too many times. She no longer sought to stop history's cruelty, only to sow gentleness within its wake. When friends urged her to flee the city during the Blitz, she refused. "I was born under Empire's sun," she told them, "and I will not die hiding from its shadow." She volunteered for night watch duty instead, tending to those displaced by the bombings, her frail frame moving through rubble with the same quiet grace that had once moved through salons. It was there, among the ruins, that a young nurse recognized her. "You're Lady Cavendish," the girl whispered. "They say you once spoke with Churchill himself." Enid smiled, her face lit by the glow of a lantern. "Then they exaggerate," she replied softly. "He spoke. I listened." The war's tide began to turn, and the Allied leaders met to imagine a world beyond victory. In Washington and San Francisco, drafts of a new order were drawn, an organization of nations that would, at least in theory, prevent the repetition of mankind's greatest mistakes. Within those drafts, among the clauses and declarations, echoes of Enid's secret work remained, like footprints half buried in sand. Historians would never trace them to her, but perhaps that was as she wished it. She learned of the charter's influence only indirectly, through a letter from her friend in Geneva, who wrote, "Some of your words have flown further than you can imagine. They may one day land under a different flag, but they will still be yours." She read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in her wooden box. Then, for the first time in years, she wept, not from sorrow, but from relief, for she understood that even a whisper, if persistent enough, can alter the course of a storm. Sometimes the world shifts because one woman whispers when others shout. When the war finally ended in 1945, London erupted into sound, a delirious chorus of bells, sirens, and laughter that seemed to rise from the city's very bones. Enid Lindeman stood among the crowd in Trafalgar Square, her face serene, her gloved hands clasped as though in prayer. Flags rippled, champagne corks flew, and strangers embraced with tears of relief. Yet for her, victory felt less like a beginning than a sigh, the exhalation of a world too weary to imagine what came next. She looked up at the sky, pale and unclouded for the first time in years, and thought, so the empire survives its own undoing. Around her, people shouted of peace, but she heard only the quieter sound beneath, the question of what peace would mean for those who had bled to secure it. The years that followed were years of unmasking. The British Empire, magnificent in rhetoric but hollowed by debt and grief, began to crumble under its own contradictions. India was the first to demand what it had already earned in blood: independence. In 1947, when the moment came, Enid listened to the announcement on her radio, sitting alone in her small flat. She closed her eyes as the voices crackled through the static, Jinnah, Nehru, Mountbatten, and when the music of the new Indian anthem began, she whispered, "At last." Her relief, however, was tempered by sorrow. The partition that followed broke her heart. She had imagined freedom as unity, not division. She could not help but think of her charter, of its plea for equality without separation. "We never learn," she wrote in her journal, "that liberation without compassion is merely another form of conquest." In our imagined history, her role during this period remains quiet yet meaningful. A few of her essays, long forgotten during the war, found new life in the post-war debates about self-governance and moral responsibility. One newspaper, unaware of the author's identity, reprinted a paragraph from the Charter of Equal Nations under the title "The Empire" as teacher and student. The piece drew unexpected attention. Intellectuals in London and New Delhi alike praised its lucidity. She read the article with a faint smile. "Perhaps," she murmured, "words do not need names to live." As independence movements surged across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, Enid watched history unfold like a tide she had predicted but could not steer. She felt both vindicated and erased. The ideals she had whispered decades before were now shouted in streets and parliaments. Yet no one remembered the woman who had first written them in the solitude of wartime London. She did not mind. "I asked for justice, not applause," she told a friend. Still, there were moments when anonymity weighed upon her, when she felt herself dissolving into the vast, impersonal current of change she had helped to imagine. The Britain that emerged after the war was poorer, humbler, and unsure of itself. Rationing lingered, cities lay in ruins, and the monarchy began to lose its aura of permanence. The empire, long described as eternal, was shrinking like a tide retreating from a cold shore. Enid moved among the remnants of that old order with quiet dignity, attending fewer events, speaking rarely, her health beginning to falter. To those who met her, she seemed like a relic from another age, elegant, precise, and faintly melancholy, yet her eyes still held that same distant fire, the one that had carried her through war, loss, and disillusionment. In 1952, she traveled briefly to Ireland to see what had become of the Kenmare estate. The house stood abandoned, the gardens overgrown. She walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing against the marble, and imagined the ghosts of conversations that had once filled the air. Voices of poets and reformers, of laughter, of plans made under candlelight. "Even the walls," she whispered, "forget what they once believed in." She gathered a single rose from the wild garden and placed it in her notebook, between the pages where she had once written of partnership between nations. Then she closed the book and left it behind on a table, a small act of surrender. Back in London, she found the world increasingly alien. The young no longer spoke of empire, but of socialism, of reconstruction, of America and the atomic age. Her ideals, noble, poetic, and human, seemed quaint beside the new vocabulary of power. She did not resent it. She understood that every generation must outgrow its dreams. But she could not help feeling that something essential had been lost, the belief that moral courage could guide nations as surely as armies did. "We are efficient now," she wrote in a letter to a friend, "but efficiency has no heart. We can rebuild cities, but can we rebuild kindness?" As the 1950s unfolded, she became a recluse by choice, retreating to a cottage near the southern coast. There she tended her garden and wrote letters she never mailed, letters to Churchill, to Huda Sha'rawi, to her younger self. "We began as witnesses," she wrote in one of them, "but ended as proof that change is only ever half mercy, half necessity." She watched the twilight from her window each evening, the horizon soft with sea mist, and thought of all the lines on maps that had been erased, all the flags replaced, all the names forgotten. The world was freer now, but not gentler. Still, she took comfort in knowing that something had shifted, that humanity, however faltering, had chosen evolution over extinction. She never remarried, though suitors appeared even in her later years. One, a retired diplomat, told her he admired her serenity. "It is not serenity," she said with a faint smile. "It is distance. I learned long ago that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the space one makes around it." When he asked if she believed the empire's end was worth the cost, she answered without hesitation, "All endings are costly. The question is whether we pay in despair or in understanding." The final entry in her surviving journal is dated 1957. It reads, "I used to think history was a ladder, each generation climbing higher. Now I see it is a circle. We return, always, to the need to belong, to the fear of the other, to the hope that this time we will do better. Perhaps the purpose is not progress, but memory." In this imagined world, her influence lingers quietly in the minds of those who shaped the new order. A diplomat in New York cites her phrases in a speech at the United Nations. A professor in Delhi teaches her ideas without knowing her name. Her dream of a world drawn not by borders but by fairness continues to flicker, faint but unextinguished. And so, when she reads in the newspapers of Ghana's independence, of the crumbling of colonial rule in Africa and Asia, she feels the ache of completion. It is not triumph she feels, but a deep, exhausted tenderness. The world had caught up to her vision, though it arrived limping, imperfect, bruised. "So it ends," she whispers to herself, "as all things do, not in glory, but in grace." By the early 1960s, the world had moved on without her. The headlines that reached Enid Lindeman's small coastal cottage no longer spoke of empire or revolution, but of rockets and television, of youth and modernity, of men stepping into the sky. London had become a city of glass and advertisements, its soot-smeared facades reborn in optimism. Yet in her secluded garden, enclosed by wind-weathered stone and the endless murmur of the sea, Enid lived in a gentler time, a time of memory, reflection, and the slow distillation of meaning. Her world had shrunk to the width of her garden path and the depth of her thoughts. But within those bounds, she found a peculiar kind of peace. The garden became her last dominion, and she ruled it with patience rather than power. Each morning she rose with the dawn, her movements slow but deliberate, tending to her roses as though they were emissaries from another age. She named them after the men and places that had shaped her life. Valentine bloomed pale and sweet. Cairo dust carried a faint scent of amber. Kenmare's grace refused to grow unless the wind came from the sea. She spoke to them as she once spoke to ministers and poets, not commanding but conversing. You see, she told them once, even in silence, things must still reach toward the light. Her neighbors thought her eccentric, a relic wrapped in shawls, always reading under the elm. They did not know that she had once moved through palaces, that her words had crossed oceans, that history itself had once bent, however slightly, around her quiet will. She rarely received visitors now. The few friends who remained from her earlier life were scattered or gone, their names becoming echoes in her letters. Still, she was not lonely. Loneliness to her had long ago ceased to be absence. It was simply space, room enough to think, to forgive, to remember. She often spent her evenings rereading her old journals, the pages brittle with time. The handwriting changed with the years, from the bold confidence of her youth to the delicate, tremulous script of her later hand. But the voice was always hers, curious, searching, never fully at rest. I was always waiting, she wrote in one entry, but I no longer remember for what. Perhaps it was never an event, but an understanding. Occasionally, the outside world would intrude upon her solitude. Reporters came once researching a feature on the last women of empire. She received them graciously but said little. One asked if she regretted having lived her life in the service of lost causes. She smiled faintly and answered, "There are no lost causes, only unfinished ones." The remark appeared in print the next week, misquoted and simplified, yet it resonated with readers who sensed in her words something timeless. Letters began arriving again, from students, from idealists, from women across the Commonwealth who had heard of her through rumor or lecture. She answered each with kindness, though her responses were brief. "Do not seek to be remembered," she told one young woman. "Seek to matter in the moment you are given. History will do what it must." Her health was failing by then, though she accepted it with her characteristic calm. A mild stroke left her weaker on one side, but her mind remained unclouded. When doctors advised her to rest, she replied, "Rest is for the uncurious." Instead, she spent her days dictating fragments of thought to a young neighbor who came to help with errands. Together, they produced what she called a collection of unfinished sentences, a series of reflections on empire, identity, and forgiveness. In one, she wrote, "Perhaps the tragedy of power is not its corruption, but its loneliness. Every ruler stands on a mountain of silence." Another read, "If empires fall, let them fall kindly." The young neighbor, Margaret, a schoolteacher, became her confidant in those final years. The two women would sit beneath the elm in the late afternoon, sipping tea and watching the gulls circle above the sea. Enid, her voice softened by age, spoke less of politics and more of time itself. "The older I grow," she said once, "the more I believe that history is not a sequence, but a pattern. Each of us, a thread, some bright, some dark, all necessary." Margaret listened in silence, knowing she was in the presence of something larger than wisdom, the rare clarity of a life examined without bitterness. Sometimes, as dusk approached, Enid would hum to herself a low, haunting melody she had learned from an Egyptian singer decades before. The sound carried across the garden like a prayer without words. She said it reminded her of the Nile at night, of lanterns reflected on the water, of conversations now buried in time. "The river never belonged to anyone," she murmured once, "and yet it carried everyone." In those moments she seemed to drift between worlds, half here, half among the shadows of memory. The past returned to her not as regret, but as companionship. She saw her younger self again, the curious girl at the harbor, the determined widow at the hospital, the woman who dared to speak of justice in rooms filled with men who mistook her charm for surrender. She did not romanticize those versions of herself. She simply greeted them, as one greets old friends. "We did what we could," she whispered one evening, looking at her reflection in the window. "And that is more than most." On her 70th birthday, a former diplomat who had once known her in Paris sent a letter. "The world you dreamed of has arrived," he wrote. "Empires are ending. Nations stand as equals now." She read the words slowly, her lips tightening into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Equals?" she murmured. "Perhaps in name, not yet in heart." She folded the letter and tucked it beside her compass and the last surviving copy of her charter. To her, those objects were not relics, but reminders that the moral world was still unfinished. As autumn came, she found herself spending more time outdoors, wrapped in blankets, watching the light change across the sea. The sunsets grew longer, their colors deeper, as if the sky itself were lingering over her garden. Sometimes she would fall asleep in her chair, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing as soft as the tide. The villagers who passed by the gate would see her there and nod quietly, not wishing to disturb the old lady who seemed part of the landscape itself. It was in those final months that she began to speak of death, though never with fear. "It is not an ending," she told Margaret, "but a folding, like the turning of a map, one world overlapping another." She spoke of meeting Valentine again, of walking once more through the corridors of the Kenmare estate, of hearing the river in Cairo whisper through her dreams. When Margaret asked what she hoped people would remember of her, she smiled faintly. "Nothing at all," she said, "but if they must, then let them say I tried to listen." On the last evening of her life, the sky turned the color of rose ash. A storm was brewing far out at sea, yet in her garden the air was calm. She sat beneath the elm, her blanket drawn close, watching as the first drops began to fall. "Time," she murmured, "is only the sea remembering its shape." Her eyes drifted closed, her lips curved into a small, contented smile. The rain came softly, washing over the roses she had tended for so many years. When Margaret found her the next morning, Enid looked almost as though she had fallen asleep mid-thought. The notebook beside her was open to a single unfinished line. "Kindness is the only empire that endures." The years after Enid Lindeman's passing carried her memory gently, as the tide carries a shell, turning it over, polishing it, never quite letting it sink. Her cottage remained untouched for a time, its garden continuing to bloom, tended by the same winds that had listened to her last words. The villagers spoke of her softly, as one speaks of an old song whose words are forgotten, but whose melody lingers. It might have ended there, her life receding quietly into local memory, had it not been for the letters. They were discovered in the spring of 1965, a decade after her death, by Margaret, the neighbor who had once sat with her under the elm. The letters were found in a small lacquered chest, beneath a folded shawl and a dried rose. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, each sealed but never posted, written in Enid's fine, unwavering hand. The first bore no date, only the name Winston. It began with affection, not reproach. "You were right," she wrote, "to believe that order sustains nations. But what sustains the soul of order itself? I thought once that it was justice. Now I think it is mercy. Empires, like men, fall because they forget how to forgive." She went on to speak of their old conversations, of the words they had traded like chess pieces, of the futures they had each imagined for the same tired world. The tone was neither boastful nor sorrowful. It was reconciliatory, as if she were finally closing the long debate that had defined both their intellects. "History will remember you," she wrote, "as the man who refused surrender. I hope it will remember me as the woman who understood why surrender is sometimes holy." Another letter was addressed to Huda Sha'arawi, written in the early 1950s but never sent, perhaps because Enid had learned that her old friend had already passed away. It was longer, more personal. "Do you remember," she wrote, "the night we spoke of rivers and nations? You said the Nile would one day run free of all flags. I told you that freedom is not a river, but a reflection, the way we see ourselves in others. You were right, of course. The river has outlived us both." In its margins, she had drawn a small sketch of the Nile at dusk. The ink faded to sepia. Beneath it, in smaller writing, she added, "We were two women trying to plant trees in sand, but sometimes, Huda, sand remembers." There were letters to others, too, to the memory of Valentine Brown, to her father, to the child she never had but often imagined. The one to her father was brief, almost childlike. "You taught me that maps give order to the world. I have spent my life unlearning it. The sea, not the line, is the truth." To the child that never was, she wrote with tenderness that trembled on the edge of sorrow, "Had you existed, I would have taught you how to listen, to storms, to silence, to people who cannot speak. I would have told you that strength lies not in victory, but in understanding why victory is never complete." But most haunting of all were the letters written not to people, but to time itself. One began simply, "To the century that shaped me." In it, she addressed her own age as if it were an intimate companion. "You were cruel and magnificent," she wrote. "You promised enlightenment and delivered machines. You promised unity and gave us nations. Yet even in your cruelty, I cannot despise you, for you taught us humility through loss. Perhaps that was your truest gift." She ended it with a question, one that seemed addressed to the reader across all ages. Will the next century learn to rule itself without rulers? Margaret read each letter slowly, as if handling relics of thought. She sensed that they were more than confessions. They were meditations distilled by time and solitude. The handwriting grew weaker near the end, but the words remained clear, shaped by the same deliberate grace that had defined Enid's life. Some letters were written in French, others in Arabic quotations she had learned long ago in Cairo. One ended with a phrase she must have repeated often in her last years. "Kindness is not weakness, it is strategy for the soul." Among the stack, Margaret found one letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." It was written on heavy cream paper, and though the ink had faded, the words were legible. "If you are reading this," it began, "then time has been kinder than I expected. I have left no monuments, only questions. But perhaps that is enough. If you must judge me, do not ask whether I was right, but whether I listened." She paused in her reading, realizing then that this letter was meant not for a person, but for posterity, for anyone who would stumble upon her legacy and try to measure its worth. The letter continued, "History belongs to the loud. I chose instead to speak softly, hoping the echo would outlast the noise. If even one voice finds courage in my silence, then I have lived well." Margaret decided not to publish the letters, at least not immediately. Instead, she kept them safe in her own home, reading them occasionally when the world outside seemed too loud or too hurried. It wasn't until years later, when scholars began to trace the origins of certain phrases found in early United Nations documents, that her conscience began to stir. In 1974, nearly 20 years after Enid's death, she sent copies of a few letters to a historian at Oxford who was researching women's influence on post-war diplomacy. The historian's response was immediate. Whoever wrote these had a mind equal to the finest political thinkers of the century. When Margaret revealed the name, there was a long silence on the telephone line, followed by quiet awe. Within a decade, fragments of the letters were published in a small academic volume titled The Quiet Architect, Unpublished Writings of Enid Lindeman. It did not sell widely, but among historians and writers, it became a kind of cult text, a collection of reflections too personal to be philosophy, too precise to be poetry. In these pages, readers found not doctrine, but depth. Enid's words carried no bitterness, no triumph. They were written with the calm of someone who had made peace with the impermanence of influence. One reviewer described her as a woman who believed in the moral geometry of compassion. Another wrote, "She taught us that the map of the world is drawn not on land, but within the conscience." As for Margaret, she lived long enough to see Enid's name return to history, not in textbooks, but in the quiet reverence of those who study the intersections of power and empathy. On the anniversary of Enid's birth in 1982, a small gathering was held at the university's library where her letters were archived. Scholars, diplomats, and a few surviving friends attended. A professor read aloud one of her last lines: "History never needed conquerors, only listeners." The room was silent afterward, as if each person present felt the truth of it settle within them like dust on sunlight. When the gathering ended, a young student placed a single white rose on the table beside the letters. Margaret, now old and frail, looked at it and whispered, "She would have called it Kenmare's Grace." The room emptied slowly, the scent of the rose lingering in the still air. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and unhurried. It washed over the university gardens, over the stone steps, over the quiet city that had once been the heart of empire. Somewhere within that sound, the steady rhythm of rain on glass, it seemed almost possible to hear her voice again, calm and luminous, speaking not of power. The 20th century, that vast theater of ambition and collapse, moved forward without her. Decades turned, empires dissolved, new powers rose speaking the same old promises in modern tongues. Yet somewhere within that great drift of history, the echo of Enid Lindeman's life remained, an undertone, faint but unbroken, like the hum one hears after a distant bell has ceased to ring. Her story, once nearly forgotten, became a quiet inheritance for those who sought not dominion, but dignity. In lecture halls and letters, in quiet conversations between women diplomats, her name began to reappear, not as legend but as reminder. She was remembered not for commanding armies or signing treaties, but for insisting, across decades of noise, that empathy was the most subversive form of power. By the late 20th century, historians began to see her life not as an ornament of high society, but as a mirror of transformation. She had been born under empire and died beneath its twilight, a witness to the slow awakening of moral consciousness that followed. Her correspondence, her anonymous writings, her charter. These fragments were reassembled into the outline of a mind that had anticipated much of what the world now called human rights. She saw before others did, one scholar wrote, that the age of mastery must yield to the age of mutuality. Yet her genius was not prophetic in the usual sense. It was humane. She did not cry for revolution, but for reconciliation. She never sought to erase history, only to teach it to listen. If one stood, in the years after her rediscovery, in the archives where her letters were kept, one could trace her journey through the tone of her handwriting. The firm loops of youth, the elegant precision of her middle years, the frail serenity of her final notes. Each stroke of ink seemed to breathe with patience. There were no manifestos here, no grand declarations of victory, only reflections, confessions, and questions. Can power exist without pride? Can civilization survive without tenderness? Those who read her work in the fluorescent light of the modern age found themselves uncomfortably humbled. It was as if she had written across time to remind the world that progress without humility is merely a different kind of empire. The irony, of course, was that her influence endured precisely because she had never sought it. Had she published her charter under her own name, it might have been dismissed as idealistic eccentricity. Had she fought openly for the causes she nurtured, she might have been silenced, mocked, or forgotten altogether. but because she moved quietly, planting questions rather than banners. Her words slipped beneath the defenses of her century and rooted themselves in its conscience. It was through such invisible labor that she redrew the moral lines of empire, not upon maps, but within minds. The cartographers of politics would never acknowledge her, but the map she imagined, one of listening instead of ruling, became the true inheritance of the world she left behind. In the 1990s, when the archives at Oxford released the complete collection of her journals, they drew the attention of filmmakers, writers, and philosophers alike. A small documentary aired one autumn evening on public television. It began with grainy footage of London in fog and a voice, aged, calm, almost wistful, reading her words. Empires are only stories told by the victors. Perhaps it is time to tell new ones. Viewers, many of them elderly, sat quietly through the broadcast, remembering their own youth beneath the Union Jack, their own lessons of pride and loss. Younger audiences watched too, startled by the relevance of her century-old reflections in an age still divided by greed and fear. In the letters that followed, people spoke of her as if she were alive again. A voice returned to remind them of their better selves. And perhaps she was. For legacies are not what we leave, but what we awaken. Her words continued to surface where compassion met conflict, quoted in the United Nations General Assembly by a woman ambassador from India, cited in a South African lecture on reconciliation, read aloud in classrooms where young students tried to understand why kindness remains so radical. Her thoughts traveled further than she ever had in life, carried not by ships or telegrams, but by the slow, enduring current of moral imagination. It is tempting in looking back to think of her as a figure apart from her age, as if she stood above it, gazing down with prescient sadness. But she was not above it. She was within it, shaped by its mistakes, scarred by its beauty. Her wisdom was not born of distance, but of participation, of loving what was broken and still believing it could heal. She did not reject her privilege. She repurposed it. She turned charm into language, elegance into diplomacy, wealth into access, and access into influence. In doing so, she proved that even within the gilded cages of history, one could still open a window. Now, more than half a century since her passing, her life reads almost like allegory. She began in sunlight, an Australian girl born beneath the empire's confident sky. She matured through fire, 2 wars, 4 husbands, endless reckonings, and she ended in twilight, tending her roses by the sea, speaking softly to the ghosts of her convictions. Yet through it all, she carried a single flame, the belief that human dignity was not the invention of any nation, but the inheritance of all. That belief, fragile as a candle, survived her, flickering on in a world that still struggles to understand its light. One imagines if her spirit could look upon the earth now, with its borders reconfigured, its flags reshuffled, its ambitions dressed anew, she would smile with both sadness and satisfaction. The empires she once questioned are gone, yet their shadows remain in other forms, economies, ideologies, technologies that rule more subtly but no less completely. She would not despair at this. She would only say, as she wrote long ago, "We are never finished, we are only beginning again." For she knew that history, like the sea she loved, is a rhythm without conclusion, a perpetual shaping and reshaping, a ceaseless negotiation between what we inherit and what we dare to imagine. In her final notebook, on the page after her last written words, there was a single hand-drawn image, a compass, simple and imperfect. Beneath it, the faint outline of a horizon and a single phrase, written so lightly it might have been breath rather than ink. Still, somewhere, a woman redraws the lines. Perhaps that is the true ending of her story, not a death, but a continuation. Somewhere in the present, a young woman stands before a map, tracing its lines, wondering who drew them and why. Somewhere, someone reads Enid's words and feels the quiet stirring of responsibility. And somewhere, in the soft persistence of thought, the world shifts again, almost imperceptibly toward fairness. The candle she once lit against the dark has long since melted, yet its flame moves from mind to mind, steady and bright. In it lives the faint hope that guided her life, the belief that imagination, when coupled with mercy, can remake the world. And though her name may fade once more into the background of history, her light remains in motion, refracted through time, eternal in spirit. And still, somewhere, a woman